I don't think there's ever really been a period in time in history where tariffs have been like an effective strategy long-term for a country. It gives you a boost. Yeah, you can protect domestic economy, domestic manufacturers, but overall it's really the path to like, it's kind of a loser's path, right? And so I'm sad to see America taking a tactic, which is basically a loser's tactic. It says, we can't compete in the world, so therefore we're going to have to build a moat. But again, I can't help reading history. And so as far as I can tell, the deal that Trump wants to make over the Ukraine is he said, well, Russia took 20% of the land and we're going to take 50% of the minerals. And Ukraine's not even going to be at the table. It's just going to be two big powers dividing up a smaller country. And there's a very good parallel for that. It happened in 1939. There was a secret agreement between a guy named Stalin and a guy named Hitler. And the target country was Poland. And so, Poland knew that it might be invaded by Germany. But the big surprise was when Germany invaded, there was a secret agreement and Russia invaded too. They didn't think they'd have to fight two major countries at the same time. And, in 3 weeks, the country was destroyed. And so Russia got half and Germany got half. And so, this Ukraine deal looks a lot like, Poland repeat. And so if you think that kind of tactic is going to result in peace, well, that's a funny kind of peace. Well, the real question is, are we going to have a big recession or depression before the midterms, or will it come after? I got to believe that there's a consequence to just basically blowing up all our trading relationships and just creating huge uncertainty in the marketplace. And we've already seen the tremors in the financial markets that they're like, yeah, this is crazy town. And, business does not like crazy town. And really that's what's going on is the U.S. is abdicating its leadership in the world. It's putting up moats. It's putting on blinders and and so isn't really a strategy. It's just like talking over other people. It's really what you saw in that conversation between Donald Trump and Zelensky. And the key line in that was when Zelensky said, what's going on in Ukraine, you're going to feel it. And Donald's response to that is, don't tell us what we're going to feel. Okay. And I understand. I've been in relationships where somebody tells me what I feel or I'm going to feel. And, I feel pretty protective. But I think one person there is looking at history and the other person there is just not looking. And Zelensky's warning was not self-serving there. I think he really was reminding us that you can ignore what's happening to Czechoslovakia or Poland. And look, the U.S. stayed out of World War II for 2 years. It stayed out of World War I for 3 years. So delaying and staying out of a war, you still ended up with a world war, right?
So President Trump took what amounted to be a victory lap on March 4th. Of course, this is set to the backdrop of macro headwinds. We've got uncertainty around tariffs, the war in Ukraine, in the Middle East, a flagging domestic economy, tapped out consumer. We know you've been positive about this new regulatory environment when it comes to, let's say, addressing debanking, fostering innovation in digital assets. What's your take, generally speaking, on how things are going so far?
Well, it is true that the Trump regime, I'll call it a regime, has been good for our industry and good for me and us personally. But, it's been kind of a wrecking ball everywhere else. I'm sure there is government waste, et cetera. Sure, everybody wants peace, but the events in the Ukraine, the events with the tariffs, the beginning of some scares in the immigration roundup, all those are clearly very, very concerning to me.
Why don't we start with tariffs? I mean, anyone who's taken economics 101 knows that, in the grand scheme of things, tariffs aren't great, economically speaking. But, on the other hand, the idea that we move manufacturing back to the US or we support, domestic production, these are potentially good things, right? How are you seeing Trump's approach in general to tariffs?
Well, again, I'm just a historian by training. We tried tariffs before in the 1930s, and that was a big input to the Great Depression. The problem with tariffs is, even if you believe Donald, that the other side pays the tariff. And he said, well, we put the tariffs on, so the other side's going to pay. Except you got to remember, the other side just put a tariff right back on us. So if the other side pays, that means we pay. So you can ask farmers how they're feeling. We went from producing 75% of the soybeans that China produces down to 25%, basically handing that over to Brazilians and whatnot. And so the concept of tariffs, if it's just one way, well, maybe that helps. But when it starts being two-way, then all you see is just the beginning of a destruction of trade, smaller export markets. And in general, tariffs to me equal a shrinking economy, especially when there's a trade war. So, and to think, tariffs won't lead to inflation. If they create such a collapse in economic activity, then you'll have a depression, right? That's been the realization in history. They either cause inflation or a depression, and neither one is good for people. And so the question is, if you think tariffs are great, why do a 25% tariff? Why not 50%? Why not 250%? So that logic of tariffs, it's kind of like Michael Saylor in Bitcoin. The only thing better than Bitcoin is more Bitcoin. And so if you're like a tariff champion, just keep slapping them on and see what happens. And so I don't think there's ever really been a period in time in history where tariffs have been like an effective strategy long-term for a country. It gives you a boost. Yeah, you can protect domestic economy, domestic manufacturers, but overall it's really the path to it's kind of a loser's path, right? And so I'm sad to see America taking a tactic which is basically a loser's tactic. It says we can't compete in the world, so therefore we're going to have to build a moat.
Is there ever a time and place for tariffs, right? Because even going back to this last administration, Biden introduced some trade bans on semiconductors. He also introduced tariffs to protect the automobile industry. Do you see those moves in the same light?
The only time I ever see, this is me personally, cause for tariffs is when we're in a situation where we're facing unfair trade. I like free trade, but I also like fair trade. So if you're in a situation where the other country is doing something that's problematic, you might use a tariff or import restrictions to get them to stop doing something to you. But I have to admit, I'm very free market in this regard. Overall, I would like to see the world move toward free and fair trade. And so other than using tariffs defensively when somebody's doing something to us, I would never want to be in a position where we're using tariffs offensively, which is exactly what Trump is doing. He's basically picking fights with our allies, taxing Canada and Mexico, which are, Mexico's currently a bigger trading partner than China, and Canada is just a little smaller. We're, as far as I can tell, just hurting ourselves by doing this. And so I would never use, personally, tariffs unless a last resort, somebody's doing something that's unfair to us. And unless Trump's view is that everybody in the world is unfair to us and all of this is a reaction to a world that's just mean to America, then to me, this is just, it's kind of a loser's strategy for competing in the world.
I think part of it is the way the world has worked thus far has been great for a lot of Americans in the context of, we've been able to move higher up that value chain. We've been able to get a lot of our goods, a lot more cheaply. But then how do you deal with, let's say, an adversary like China, for instance, where, they have their Made in 2025 program. And I think everyone's been surprised at how far they've been able to accelerate in the last 10 years. They dominate the supply chains for things like batteries, for EVs, solar panels, rare earth metals, lithium, et cetera.
Well, again, if they're dumping those goods, yes, then I see you can have import restrictions, you can even have tariffs, and there is some dumping in those areas. And China's decided to make solar panels, they just make them so cheap that people here buy them and just use them as fencing, because it's cheaper than buying, regular supplies at the hardware store. And so look, that's a game where you got to get down, roll up your sleeves and play for market access. But the idea of just general tariffs as a way of gating access to the US, unless you're really doing it to open up access in the other direction, I just don't see where it goes. There are some industries where China is just going to win, right? They have made the investment. They're going to do things cheaper than we can. But there's areas where we win too. Like we're really good at certain things to do with software and whatnot, where, we make the operating systems that run all the phones in the world. And so like we can like leverage those kinds of investments and play to our strengths. We can compete like on AI, although like now we have cheap competition from China. But, with China coming up, I don't think we're going to protect ourselves long-term just from tariffs. We're going to have to compete with them at the level they're playing at, which means we're going to have to invest and out-innovate and out-produce them. Tariffs are a short-term fix if you've really like gotten behind and you just need to fix something. But it looks to me like we're just relying on tariffs as a crutch for not investing in our own industries and competing. We're slashing investment, we're slashing research and development, and we're beginning to act like developing countries that just can't compete in the world. So they put up tariffs just to kind of control the balance of payments between their country and other countries. And so, again, I don't know what else to call it other than a loser strategy. And I don't think we need to have a loser strategy. I think America could compete, and we don't need moats to do it. We could have strategic investment like China does to target industries we want to like develop. And we were beginning to do that, but this administration is, cutting those investments.
One of the more stunning scenes that I've seen in my lifetime probably was that showdown between Zelensky and Trump at the Oval Office.
Yeah.
His proponents will say, look, Trump is trying to stop all of these wars. He's trying to stop war in the Middle East. He's trying to stop this war in Ukraine. He's trying to stop needless bloodshed. How would you analyze his diplomacy?
Well, I think Chamberlain said the same thing when he like turned Czechoslovakia over to Germany. He's like, well, peace in our time. And then came Poland, right? And then came World War II. So, yeah, I mean, you can put up the white flag. You can basically be complicit. You can be appeaser. And yeah, everybody can buy time by capitulating. But again, I can't help reading history. And so as far as I can tell, the deal that Trump wants to make over the Ukraine is he said, well, Russia took 20% of the land and we're going to take 50% of the minerals. And Ukraine's not even going to be at the table. It's just going to be two big powers dividing up a smaller country. And there's a very good parallel for that. It happened in 1939. There was a secret agreement between a guy named Stalin and a guy named Hitler. And the target country was Poland. And so, Poland knew that it might be invaded by Germany. But the big surprise was when Germany invaded, there was a secret agreement and Russia invaded too. They didn't think they'd have to fight two major countries at the same time. In 3 weeks, the country was destroyed. And so Russia got half and Germany got half. And so, this Ukraine deal looks a lot like, Poland repeat. And so if you think that kind of tactic is going to result in peace, well, that's a funny kind of peace. It just means that countries get consumed, quickly. It might not be a war, but it could be the end of a country's sovereignty and the loss of people's freedoms and rights. I mean, that was the beginning of, I think any country suffered bigger losses in the Holocaust than Jews in Poland. And so, maybe that was peaceful, process, but it was bloody hell, right? So this concept of capitulating to Putin and calling that peace, just ask Chamberlain, see how that worked for Europe last time around.
Critics of the war might argue that, prolonging it, all it's going to do is further push, let's say, Russia into, China's sphere of influence. It's catalyzing this rise of the BRICS. There's been less credibility in the U.S. dollar powered payment system, which is an opportunity, again, maybe for China creating its own sort of payment channels with a renminbi. Given all of that, what do you see as sort of the end game here?
Well, the end game for who? I mean, the end game for Putin is to basically establish a sphere of influence, which means all the countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union are going to be essentially part of the new Soviet Union again, either directly or indirectly, because he can basically pressure them. It could mean that China has a free hand to basically take over Taiwan and pressure other countries on its border, like take sea rights from the Philippines, from Vietnam, et cetera. And I guess for the U.S., it clears our right to make Canada the 51st state, and maybe Greenland number 52, and Panama Canal. But I mean, that's one version of the world. George Orwell described it, three big powers. They just basically bully everybody else in the neighborhood. And yeah, that's one vision of the world. I think that Donald's basically signed off on. It's not the vision I would like to see in the world. I'd like to see, just because you're a smaller country doesn't mean you just deserve to be bullied or absorbed by a bigger country. And that some people think that's just the way it goes, that the Americas belong to the United States, and Central Europe, Asia belongs to Russia, and, Asia belongs to China, used to belong to Japan. And I think that view of the world will lead eventually to World War III. So I believe that it would be better to stand up to the Russians now, having things happen like Finland and Sweden join NATO. Some of the countries like the Baltic countries and Poland step up their defense capabilities. I think Russia can be contained. I think it's how we've kept the peace for the last 75 years since World War II. Look, it doesn't have to be done just the way it is. Europe can stand up and do more. But for the U.S. to actually cut off like our intelligence sharing with the Ukraine is basically just giving Putin a free hand to beat up, not just on the Ukraine, but beat up on Europe, put pressure on all the countries that are on the border of Russia. And I mean, anybody who thinks that, Putin's not going to do that, he won't take advantage of that situation is, as far as I can concerned, they're smoking the crack pipe. I mean, all you have to do is listen to what Putin says, watch what he does. There's no mystery. I mean, he's told everyone what he's going to do, just like, Hitler wrote it in a book. So nobody was surprised, really, when Hitler just did what Hitler said he was going to do. And so Putin's telling us what he's going to do. China's made it pretty clear what they want to do. And now we're just living in a world where you can get away with it. There is no concept. I mean, we signed a treaty with the Ukraine and Russia to take all the nuclear weapons out of the Ukraine in exchange for preserving their borders. Now, who do you think is ever going to take nuclear missiles out again when, the paper you signed to get them to take it out is just a joke, right? We didn't honor our end of that treaty. Anybody has noticed that, Russia's kind of gone over those borders, and Ukraine has no nuclear deterrent because we got them to take it out. And we have not provided any security guarantee. England was a party to that treaty as well. And, we've let it just go by the way by.
One of the hallmarks of this administration is probably its, let's say, chaotic nature. I think we can appreciate their commitment to making the U.S. a leader in digital assets. But then you also get meme coins on Inauguration Day, right?
Yeah.
So similarly with the strategic reserve, and you can argue whether or not it makes sense for the country, but then you have the president this past Sunday just randomly out of the blue tweeting the 5 crypto assets he's chosen. First, thoughts on that process, and then also thoughts on the basket of assets.
Best thing they said about Mussolini was he made the trains run on time. Well, yeah, okay, that's true. That was a big feat for Italy. In Germany under the Nazis, they made Volkswagens, right? So it's not like good stuff doesn't happen under bad political governments. I mean, even a broken clock is right twice a day. And so, look, I have to admit, for our industry, it's been terrific. And the idea of a strategic reserve, I think, is a terrific idea. I think it'd be great to have a strategic reserve for oil, a strategic reserve for gold, a strategic reserve for crypto assets, a strategic reserve for anything that is worth having on a rainy day. So to me, the fact that there'd be a crypto strategic reserve and they put those 5 assets in it is just sensible, just like we have one for foodstuffs and for oil, for gold. Basically, that's just putting stuff aside for a rainy day. And so I do support those efforts. Anybody can quibble as too much of an allocation to crypto versus gold versus oil. That's for the pinheads to figure out. But I don't have a problem with putting something aside for a rainy day, and especially something that could appreciate in value and help us offset the national debt that we have. So I am happy about that, but that doesn't make up for other things that are being torched out there.
For Trump, he's about America first. He keeps talking now about this new golden age for America that's just begun. And obviously there's disagreement as to whether or not that's the case. How do you see America best maintain its, let's say, preeminent leadership, within the world? How should the U.S. Be leading from the front?
Well, the good things would be I would like us to be a leader in innovation. And so I am obviously supportive of the innovations that happen in the blockchain industry. I like the innovations in AI. I thought we were making innovations on the energy side, like innovations in solar. I know we have to compete with China there, but even innovations in fracking that we can get like better at getting out the oil that is there. And one day it'll be gone, and I don't think the dinosaurs are coming back. But basically, innovation is the way we maintain a higher standard of living, better productivity. And so I would like to see us investing more in R&D, both R and D. And it's something we used to do. It's what propelled the U.S. into the leadership back in the 1950s and into the 60s. But we've been skimping on that ever since and riding on fumes. I mean, that to me is the key to a high standard of living, is to basically out-innovate the other side. And in spite of some of our policies, we continue to out-innovate the world in a lot of industries. And if you look at the top 20 market cap companies in the world, I think 17 of them are in the United States. I think maybe one of them is in China, right? Maybe one is in Europe and one is like, the oil company out of Saudi Arabia. And so we're still pretty damn good. But if we want to be better and keep the lead, I would basically do things that are pro-innovation and also pro-competition. Like when we're allowed to compete, we do pretty well. I don't see the fact that we're like backing away from innovation in other areas besides blockchain and AI as a good thing. And I don't think things we do that are like shows an unwillingness of us to compete in the world as a good thing long term. It makes us fat and lazy.
What do you think of Doge?
Imagine if instead of Elon doing it, the government had just hired McKinsey to do it. Now, there might be some outrage as well, but they would just give McKinsey the right to look at all this data and stuff like that. So whether it's Elon or Mark Zuckerberg, it's janky because there's not like a ethical wrapper in it. But look, somebody probably does need to go through everything, and you could do basically what they call zero-based budgeting, take everything back to zero and then figure out what's really needed, as opposed to just recursively just continuing to fund things, whether it's USAID or the CFPB. So that shakeup probably is needed at the Pentagon. It's really, it's needed all across the government. I don't think anybody would argue that the government was functioning well. It's great that it's happening. The fact that Elon's running it, it's creepy shit. But, I've been to Washington just 2 weeks ago, and it's a different feeling. People always thought Washington was recession-proof. Washington is no longer recession-proof, but they are not cutting fat. They're cutting bone. They're just basically cutting everything up and then burning everything to the ground. And we'll have to figure out what it's like when we don't have enough air traffic controllers and planes and helicopters crash. And, people have to figure out whether when you go to the national park and it's closed because there's nobody working there, whether that's really what we want. So the things that we're cutting, let's make clear, we're cutting fat, but we're cutting bone, we're cutting off limbs, we're cutting off, for some agencies, we're cutting the head off, right? We're just not going to have, an effective fill in the blank. So, but I have to admit, and I think a lot of Americans are kind of like the fact that there's a shakeup. I do feel really badly for folks that really were good civil servants doing a good job, and they're just basically collateral damage in this process. This is what happens when you have an election. You get what you asked for, and the American people spoke. They did not want the status quo. So right now they're blowing everything up. And, I talked to my electorate, and basically there weren't many people out there putting up their hands saying, I want to keep going with the status quo and a few tweaks, which is pretty much what the Democrats offered. We'll just tweak the existing system and it'll be okay. It's not that bad. Well, most people thought it was pretty bad. And so Trump is not disappointing in this regard. He, with the help of Elon, is just, ready, fire, aim. And so it's a shit show out there, but that's what people signed up for.
Well, Trump certainly hit the ground running, at least talking about a lot of his policies, executing on some of those policies. And it's happening very quickly. it's very disruptive. Do you see a potential backlash in a couple of years at the midterms? And is there an opportunity here for the Democrats?
Well, the real question is, are we going to have a big recession or depression before the midterms, or will it come after? I got to believe that there's a consequence to just basically blowing up all our trading relationships and just creating huge uncertainty in the marketplace. And we've already seen the tremors in the financial markets, that they're like, yeah, this is crazy town. And, business does not like crazy town. What I can't tell you is we'll have a recession or a depression. There's going to something happen. And again, I don't know whether it's going to happen before the midterms. If it happens before the midterms, probably the House will flip. The Senate is, I don't quite know the math on the Senate, but really it's Trump's big risk in just basically doing chaotic stuff and blowing everything up is he'll cause enough pain that he'll lose a bunch of House seats in the midterm in 2026. And they'll finally actually be, the Democrats will have some branch of government where they can do something. But right now, the Democrats are just basically, they're out of the game. They've been wiped out in the Supreme Court. The last three, appointments were really, it became a 6-3 court. And clearly they're wiped out in the Senate and the House. Everybody knows what's going on in the White House. So we're in this for the next 18 months, right? More than 18 months before we get a reprieve. Not clear whether this thing's going to blow up before those 18 months are out.
On the topic of innovation, crypto czar David Sachs, he promised stablecoin legislation within 100 days. We are seeing the Genius Act gain, bipartisan traction. Really good name. Yeah. I know you've been engaging with policymakers, elected officials who are working on that bill. How are you feeling about it in terms of its impact on the industry? What's it doing right? What should be included in there? What are your thoughts?
One is there were three forms of money that are all innovations that could happen over the legacy financial system, which is 50 years old. One could be central bank digital currency. We're not going to do that because people on the right and the left are worried about different aspects about it, whether it's privacy controls or just too much government control, whatever. It's not going to happen. That's been taken off the table. So that just leaves stablecoins and potentially deposit tokens, which is the thing we're really pushing, which is using blockchain technology, but doing it through the banking system versus like stablecoins, which are going to use blockchain technology, but it's going to be rolled out by fintechs, kind of like the way Tether and USDC already work. So I support the fact that there's going to be some stablecoin legislation to make it more likely that companies are going to issue stablecoins in the U.S., in U.S. dollars for use here and around the world. And it'll be done at states level. Have a form of can passport anything they pass to the other states. And when you get to $10 billion, the feds come in. And so I think that's all good. That'll get the concept of money running on chain off the ground. I've noticed that the legislation has no compliance controls beyond the first sale and redemption. So whatever happens in the middle, it's like the folks that issue those stablecoins are just putting a paper bag on their head. And what could go wrong? It's kind of like a perfect infrastructure for Silk Road, right? And so nobody's worried about that right now. But eventually Obama will go off, or some big scandal will happen, and it'll be paid for with stablecoins. And people say, well, why didn't we know? Well, we didn't have any controls. And well, who the hell did that? And all of us. And so that's when an opportunity for something like deposit tokens comes along, because it will have identity, it will have controls, and it'll use the same technology. It'll just be safer and not as rock and roll as stablecoins, but it may be the ultimate actual winner. We're counting on that. We're planning for that. But in the meantime, moving stablecoins from offshore to onshore, I think that's healthy, because it means the U.S. is learning to dance with digital assets, and it's going to learn its way through it. And we don't have to get it 100% right, but it sure is a hell of a better thing for us to be leading the way in this than basically dragging the chain and having offshore companies issuing the dollars that are used all around the world, in my opinion. And again, I'm not against Tether. I'm not against anything. I'm just saying I'm pro the whole home team, and having good legislation will result in many folks basing here. And, we at Vast Bank, and other banks were investing, and we'd be happy to support stablecoins. We think we have a better product, deposit tokens, but we're not here to be the arbiters of what the market actually wants. We'll support both and see what the market decides.
Oh, we saw that Tether pulled out of Europe. They felt the MiCA stablecoin regulations were a bit too onerous for them. And they also just came out and said, hey, look, there's not much of a market for stablecoins in Europe in actuality. So, that's why it didn't really matter if we pulled out. What are your sort of thoughts there? Because I know you've had an interest in Europe. You're looking at some banks in Europe. Actually, you're looking at a potential bank in Ukraine as well. Any thoughts there?
I mean, even stablecoins in the US, we Americans, we can use them. We don't really need them the way everybody else does. And Europe's got a pretty good system for Europe. But stablecoins are really for all the rest of the world. And they're also for moving between the different regions of the world. And so, Tether basically told, Europe to go take a hike. You're ruining the party. You're telling us what the mix of assets are that have to back. And it just doesn't make sense. But that's Europeans, and they're not, they're not really worried about what makes sense. They're just sort of worried about control, and they have a particular way they want the world to work. And Tether's just made a decision, which I understand them making a decision. This is just not worth the candle. I would just comment that for deposit tokens, they're issued by banks, so they're not covered by MiCA, and they're covered by existing bank regulation. And we need no new authority to do them. So there's going to be something like stablecoins working in Europe, even if Tether's not there, either other stablecoins that did comply or deposit tokens. Europe's pretty savvy. They'll figure out how to use a digital asset version of fiat currency, whether it's the dollar or the euro or whatever else. So, I'm excited about our prospects in Europe, even if Tether feels it's like it's too hot in the kitchen.
So as you mentioned, we do have a stablecoin product. It's called USBC. Today, it's licensed and issued out of the Bahamas. Given regulatory clarity in the U.S., would you move that issuance back to the U.S.?
Yeah, Bahamas for us is training wheels. So the U.S. didn't have legislation in this regard. We started where there was legislation. We hoped that we would be either able to see legislation or get a bank. Guess what? Both are happening. So there will be stablecoin legislation. We could bring the stablecoin on shore. Our inclination is to just drop that and just go right to a deposit token issued by a consortium of U.S. banks using crypto rails, but with Reg E protections, which is chargeback protections, FDIC insurance, protections from unfair, deceptive, abusive practices, what's called UDAP, and in a form that the money can actually be put to work in loans. All those things are terrific improvements over stablecoins, but even stablecoins themselves are way better than just the legacy systems we have. So it's great to see this pulled on shore. The Bahamas for us was a place to start until the U.S. got its act together. It looks like it's getting its act together, and looks like we got a bank, and our bank should be clean to do business, hopefully by this summer.
Any final thoughts?
The midterm elections are just 18 months away. Clearly, we're going to see a continuing pace of massive disruption in our economy, in our democracy. I do think that we could be facing a constitutional crisis. I do believe that, the legislature was supposed to pass the laws. The judiciary is supposed to interpret the laws, and the president is supposed to faithfully execute the laws. We've lost that balance of power. Trump has said that, the Supreme Court, the courts can say whatever they want. Let them try to enforce it. And, Congress can pass whatever funding bill it wants, but I'm sitting on top of the payment system, and I'm just going to impound the payments. And so, there's a certain number of people that they're looking at the math behind all this, and they're saying, 2 + 2 = 5. That's fine. That's America. That's our form of democracy. To me, that is not the democracy we actually anticipated or set up, which was supposed to be a balance of power between those three branches of government. And we'll see whether our system is resilient enough, and this is just like a bad cold, and we can get back to a balance of power between Congress, the Supreme Court, and the executive, or else this is really sort of a slip slide, and we're going to be down, we're going to be down in Banana Republic territory for what's going on in this country, and we may not have an easy way back to being a leader in the realm of democracy. That's what's up for grabs. That's what keeps me involved in the political system and makes me aware that even though what's happening right now is very economically beneficial for our industry, for our ecosystem, and for me personally, it doesn't make me sleep very well at night. So I am concerned that, when all this blows up, all these great things that happen for our industry, it might be pitchforks. So, we are taking for granted the protections we have that keep us all safe and keep us basically operating under the law, including laws that we don't really like. But right now the law is on being tested all across the realm, and the political system is not constraining Trump, neither his own party, the Republicans, or the Democrats. And so this is new territory for this country. Other parts of the world have seen this, and it has not ended well. That does not mean it will not end well here. Our system may course correct. I'm going to do everything I can to help it course correct. I'm still super positive about our country and our prospect. And I think we do have points in our history when we get a little bit misdirected. I hope we can pull this one back out. But it's kind of distressing every day and every night what you see on the news and what's really happening in Washington, in this country, and really at other countries as a consequence of us essentially abdicating our leadership. And really that's what's going on, is the U.S. is abdicating its leadership in the world. It's putting up moats. It's putting on blinders. And and so isn't really a strategy. It's just like talking over other people. It's really what you saw in that conversation between Donald Trump and Zelensky. And the key line in that was when Zelensky said, what's going on in Ukraine, you're going to feel it. And Donald's response to that is, don't tell us what we're going to feel. And I understand. I've been in relationships where somebody tells me what I feel or I'm going to feel. And, I feel pretty protective. But I think one person there is looking at history and the other person there is just not looking. And Zelensky's warning was not self-serving there. I think he really was reminding us that you can ignore what's happening to Czechoslovakia or Poland. And look, the U.S. stayed out of World War II for 2 years. It stayed out of World War I for 3 years. So delaying and staying out of a war, you still ended up with a world war, right? And first one was 25 million people dead. The next one was 50 million people dead and huge economic destruction. And each was rectified by the U.S. reversing a course of isolation and putting its head in the sand and finally realizing this thing of thinking that because there's an Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, what happens in the world doesn't matter. It does matter. I'm sorry, America, but, like it or not, we're in a position where what we do matters. And so this strategy of ignoring all the other signals, all our interactions with everything else, and just basically taking a short-term view, and doing everything on a transactional nature without building trust and relationships with anyone else in the world, basically being complicit with our enemies and taking a dump on the heads of our allies and friends. It works about as well in politics as it does in personal relations. So we'll see what happens in 2026. But thanks for the time today, Alec.
Thank you, Greg. Sobering, but ultimately necessary message. As a reminder, the long-term vision for USBC is as a tokenized bank deposit, but it exists already today as a stablecoin with best-in-class rewards on the Uphold exchange. Earn your 5.25% in rewards today. Link in the description below.